Hello, this is Adam Zen's Theistic Scuffles here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a moral argument for the existence of God, and I'm going to be addressing and refuting TBS in the time it takes to change an oil filter. Melanie, would you happen to have an oil filter that I could borrow?
Sure, I happen to be randomly holding one.
Why, thank you very much. You know, every day people borrow items. It really makes our world go round. However, it isn't just physical items which are borrowed. People borrow from worldviews as well. In Christian theism, there are universal and moral absolutes which do apply across the board, across different times and different cultures. God has acted favorably, lovingly towards his creatures, towards his creation, and his creatures are expected, that is, have an ethical obligation to love in turn. However, this sort of principle whereby duties are generated or recognized does not follow from non-theistic systems where there is no ethical norm by which others could have an obligation towards helping or loving their fellow creatures.
Well, there are at least two major problems with TBS's utilitarian framework, whereby it is supposed that the ethical obligation to maximize the happiness and well-being, security of others accrues or is conferred upon individuals. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these two problems, but instead I'll go over them briefly, and then I'm going to deal primarily with a sub-problem. The first major issue is that he never really spells out in detail how the maximization of the health and happiness of others might, in fact, minimize the health or require excessive or extreme sacrifices on the part of individuals. If everyone concurred with such a crazy scheme, how long would it take before society itself crumbled? But really, the burden of proof is on TBS at this point to spell this out, how individuals are supposed to do this for others and not sacrifice their own level of happiness. Secondly, he never really explains how naturalism would cause this ethical obligation to occur. That is the utilitarian obligation.
Hello, Theistic Scuffles again. I actually had to switch positions because I wasn't making much progress on getting the oil filter out with my right hand, so I've switched to the left now. Getting back to the two major issues with TBS's utilitarian position, the sub-problem that I'd actually like to deal with is actually follows from the issues, the difficulties of deriving ethical norms from a naturalistic worldview or frame of reference. It's at this point that utilitarianism itself not only, almost there with this oil filter, utilitarianism really has its own ethical obligations that not only do they not follow from naturalism, but in fact they need to be borrowed from the Christian worldview. Now, you might say, how can that be? How could it be that the principle of sacrificing one pleasure for oneself in order to help others would be in fact from the Christian worldview? But TBS does borrow here because this would be something which would be derived from a commander or an issuer of commands and someone who sets a moral example, and that would be the Christian God. We don't necessarily have a moral authority which would derive from the naturalistic worldview. Okay, I'm going to have to switch positions again.
But why is it that one couldn't derive ethical guidelines from atheism?
Oh, okay, finally got this oil filter loose. It took a lot of tugging and torquing with the hands, but no oil filter wrench was needed. So why can't we, this is a decent question, why is it that we can't derive a decent or solid ethical guideline from atheism? For example, maybe atheism doesn't imply naturalism. Well, it would be incumbent upon the individual asserting atheism to show how a moral standard could be given and how this standard might be applied in various situations. Again, we have a great lack that is lacking in TBS's presentation because we don't know to what extent we ought to make our own sacrifices in order to maximize the health and the welfare of others. Now, admittedly, the same question could be posed to Christian theism. Well, to what extent should we? Well, the Christians have a moral authority called the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit gives guidance and wisdom in interpreting the Scriptures for how you would derive ethical guidelines. It wouldn't tell you exactly how to love your neighbor or how to love God, but the Holy Spirit is there and is present as a yardstick, as a control, so that applications of ethical standards are done in a way which is beneficial to God's will in society.
But what exactly would suggest that the ethical guidelines of the Holy Spirit would be any less subjective than the ethical guidelines of humans?
Okay, make sure after you remove the oil filter, of course, that you check that to see that the gasket was not left on the oil filter portion of the vehicle. In this case, it had been, so that's very important. Otherwise, the new oil filter will not adhere properly. This is a good question. Often in the secular mind, we have an absolute kind of a rigid distinction or an all or nothing distinction between subjective and objective, and the idea will be that, well, if it's related to the Holy Spirit, the guidance or the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, working out ethical norms in the believer's life and the Christian's life, well, that must be subjective. Well, actually, this is true and not true at the same time. There is more of a moral foundation for getting from point A to point B, getting from a moral authority to a moral norm. And that's really what we're lacking in naturalism and most types of philosophical supports for the atheist worldview. We don't really have a moral authorization to go from an is to an ought, from a natural state of affairs, whether it be some sort of evolutionary process or law, to a moral norm that would guide or govern how we act towards each other. However, we do have that in the Scriptures. We have ethical norms, and the guidance of the Holy Spirit is somewhat subjective, but that's actually a good thing, because how I am supposed to help the poor and the needy might be a little bit different from how you would be called to support the poor and the needy. Well, thank you very much for tuning in. We'll talk to you later next time.